Well, hey, everybody. It's good to be back. We're moving into a story. I'm going to be honest. I hate calling things in the Bible stories because in stories in our world, it's like we tell stories. And I know that we have our life stories and all that stuff, but these things are real. So, and the technical word is pericope, and I just hate that word. To say, this next pericope of Jesus, it's like, no. So I don't even know what to, next event that we have recorded in Mark. And it starts in verse 31 of chapter 7, and it runs to the end of chapter 7, and we're not going to get through it in this session, but we'll get through it soon, and we'll actually be able to move on to chapter 8. Isn't that amazing? We'll be in the chapter that marks us halfway through the book of Mark. So anyway, I'm glad to be here. Let me pray for us. I can't think of anything to tell you. I did see a grandson this past weekend that I'd never seen before. He's 8 months old. And he didn't quite know what to do with me for a few minutes, but once he noticed that all of his brothers and his sister were all over me, and having a great time, he just wanted to get involved. So I'll just leave it at that. And if you want to see a picture of the happy family, talk to my wife because she takes pictures constantly. Anyway, let me pray and we'll get going on this. Father, I am so thankful that we have this particular moment in your son's life recorded in the Bible. And it speaks to me personally, and it speaks to us of your son's heart and your heart towards all of us and what you intended for the world and all kinds of stuff. It's just such a great moment in this book from Mark, and thank you for it. And I pray that I will do it justice and I'll speak well of your majesty and your deep love for us. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we're in chapter 7, verse 31. I'll read it, and then we'll get going. This is what we read in the NLT. It says, Jesus left Tyre and went up to Sidon before going back to the Sea of Galilee and the region of the 10 towns. A deaf man with a speech impediment was brought to him, and the people begged Jesus to lay his hands on the man to heal him. Jesus led him away from the crowd so they could be alone. He put his fingers into the man's ears. Then, spitting on his own fingers, he touched the man's tongue. Looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, Ephphatha, which means, be opened. Instantly, the man could hear perfectly, and his tongue was freed so he could speak plainly. And Jesus told the crowd not to tell anyone. But the more he told them not to, the more they spread the news. They were completely amazed and said again and again, everything he does is wonderful. He even makes the deaf to hear and gives speech to those who cannot speak. This is a really powerful moment. And it is going to amplify, I will say, or further amplify the breadth of the answer to the question, who is this man? This story is directly connected to the episode that we just had with the Gentile woman who had a daughter who was demon possessed, and there are some commonalities to it. Now, I will have to talk about, there's some scholarly argument about some of these commonalities. We'll get to that in a minute. But the general position of most people is that both of these stories take place in Gentile territory, that this is a Gentile person in need in both cases, and Jesus responds in unpredictable ways in both of these stories. Now, they're very different, the ways that he responds, but they're unpredictable just based on the cultural norms. And that Now, there is going to be, you'll get it in a minute, why some people argue that all those things aren't true, but I tend to believe they're all true. And this healing is only recorded in this book, in Mark. We don't find it anyplace else. There's a hint to it in Matthew, but not any way that you would naturally come to the conclusion that these are the same stories. There's clearly a belief on the part of Mark that this story fits into his broader theme, which is to include it in telling us more about who this man is. That Mark feels that way. Now, there is a reason, probably, and now we can't be 100% certain about this, but I think it's probably true. There's a reason that we only find it in one gospel. And that the other two synoptic writers, that would be of Matthew and Luke, may have left it out because there are aspects to this story that superficially, and I'm going to use that word honestly, superficially, link what happens as Jesus heals this deaf man to pagan healing practices. Practices that they wanted to avoid mentioning because Matthew's audience is Jewish, and the last thing they need to have in the story of Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, is him doing something that sounds like he's using pagan magic practices. And with Luke, he's writing to Gentiles, yes, but what the Gentiles, particularly his audience, starts with Theophilus. What he doesn't want to do is paint Jesus as a healer who looks like he might be using the kind of practices for healing that Theophilus came out of to follow Jesus. And so it could possibly be that they, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but Mark's theme seems to be so important to him, the theme of answering that question, who is this man, that he's willing to risk the possible questioning of these healing practices to make his larger point. And much more of this to come later, but this story begins, as it does much of Mark, with geographical descriptions of where these things are taking place. And there has been some debate about this description. I'm just going to reread it to you. It says, Jesus left Tyre and went up to Sidon before going back to the Sea of Galilee and the region of the 10 towns. Now, the debate, and I just want you to know that the debate primarily, there's a scholar, his name is Stein, and if you want to read all about it, he's got so many pages about this, about why he thinks that when we get this description that Mark doesn't give us the whole thing. Because here's the bottom line. Jesus is, and in the Greek it says, Jesus again left Tyre. Now that either implies that he'd been there twice and he left there again, or else it means that it's just all a part of the first leaving for Tyre. I mean, it's an odd word to find in there, but I'll just say that scholars want to fight about that. But that the route that describes in Mark is Tyre is north of Galilee, about 20 miles, but Sidon is 20 miles further north. And then it says that he goes out of that place and it says, going back to the Sea of Galilee, which means he would have had to go, let me get it right for you on the camera. So he goes up, and then he goes over to the east, and then he comes down about 40 miles to get to Decapolis, or the region of the 10 towns. Now, this is a really weird pattern for Jesus to follow. There's no way to retrace the journey by roads. There were no roads that would have taken him. He could get to Sidon, but to go from Sidon on the coast of the Mediterranean far enough east to then come straight south down to the Sea of Galilee into this Decapolis area, which is the area of 10 towns, this would have all been traveled by trails and things like that. There were no roads whatsoever. Now, people go, well, why on earth would Jesus travel like that? Well, there's no logical reason. Some people would say that he just wanted to go this back road because remember the reason he went to Tyre in the first place was to get away, to be alone with his disciples and to teach them and to have some time away and to have a break. And boy, if he wants to have a break, it's going that route that goes up and over and down. By the way, the Decapolis is not even a legal designation. This is a sort of a colloquial name. It's sort of like saying the North Side. We don't even know what the 10 cities were. People fuss over what the 10 cities were. Now the Stein guy who does not believe that Jesus came down to Decapolis, which we'll talk about in a moment, he doesn't think he stopped there. He thinks that Mark left out the fact that they got a boat and went all the way across the Sea of Galilee and that the whole story takes place with Jewish people on the other side of the sea. Now I'm not gonna go much more into detail about this, but this is important because with Dr. Stein and his thinking, it changes the whole story. Because Jesus is not in a Gentile area. Decapolis is a Gentile area. And we've been there before, if you recall. Jesus crossed over in a boat and he landed on the shore and was greeted by a man who had multiple demons in him. And Jesus cast the demons out and they went into the pigs and they ran down into the water and drowned. And all the people in that area were so afraid of Jesus that they said, leave us alone. This is the place where Jesus, he's right back there. If he stays there, when he now heals this deaf man who can't speak, this is changing the whole tenor of the way people feel about Jesus in this area. Now, see, I think that's a better story than the fact that he got on a boat that nobody mentioned and they all went over and everything's Jewish, because the next thing that happens, and I hate to be all rambly here, but the next thing that happens after Jesus does this healing is that people come out by the thousands and he has to feed 4,000 more people. And if they're not Jews but Gentiles, that's a whole nother thing than if he crossed over and he healed a Jewish deaf man and Jews came out to hear him. It just says more about the heart of God if he does all this stuff with Gentiles, okay? I'm just going to say that. Now, Decapolis, this area, there were Jews that lived there, but it was predominantly Gentile. They outnumbered the Jews so much that just like in Tyre, the area was considered Gentile even though there were Jews that were there. Now, we all know that when we read one thing, it's important, but when we read something that's similar in twice, it's really important, and that's why I think we get this story up against the story of the woman who had the daughter with the demon next to each other in Mark, because he's making a point about Jesus's heart towards everyone. Now, that's just what I'm thinking. Remember, too, that Jesus, as I said, we'd been there before. His reputation in that area was as somebody that everybody was scared to death of. I think Jesus had some reputation repair to do, or he'd been thinking about it, and he just wanted to go back, and he wanted to get there by a surreptitious route so that he wouldn't be followed by all the people. If he'd have come back from Tyre down into Galilee, he'd have had a big crowd, they'd have followed him around, and he wanted to go over to Decapolis, it'd been a big crowd. The same thing would have happened again that happened to him the last time, and he needed to what? Have some time with his disciples, and he needed to change the tone for some people that God cares about. Now, Mark doesn't give us a clue in his text as to why he chose this route and why he would go to this unexpected way. The only important point for Mark is that Jesus made the journey to get to a particular man, and that all works for the bigger purpose is about telling us more about who this man is. Okay? again, if that's Dr. Stein is right, it changes everything. I don't think he's right, but he's a big shot and people listen to him. But what Mark tells us next is that once Jesus was known in the area, it says they, if you notice, it says, it says, a deaf man was brought to him, and it says, and the people begged Jesus to lay his hands on him. In the Greek, it says, they brought a man to him. And this implies either a crowd or at least a larger group of people. And they bring to Jesus a man who is deaf and who has difficulty speaking. Now, the word that's used here in the text to describe his difficulty speaking is only found two places in the Bible, and one of them is not even in the Hebrew, but it's in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, and it's Isaiah 35:5. And I'm actually I want to read it because this is so powerfully connected. And then I'll tell you about the word in a second. Let me just read to you this verse. It says, when he comes, this is all about the Messianic arrival, okay? It says, and when he comes, meaning the Messiah, he will open the eyes of the blind and unplug the ears of the deaf. The lame will leap like a deer, and those who cannot speak will sing for joy. That those who cannot speak, that word is, it's magalalon is what it is, the Greek word magalalon. It does not mean mute at all. It does not mean mute. It means somebody who has a speech impediment that is so terrible that when he tries to speak, he cannot be understood. This is way worse than being mute, okay? This is somebody who has the ability to make sound, but he has no ability to be understood, such as his speech impediment. And also, there's another thing that's going on here. In the Greek, and I could talk about it if you want to talk to me about it, but the Greek implies that he wasn't always deaf, that he became deaf. Now, I just have to say that Mark's he uses that word to describe this man, and it's only one place in the Old Testament, and it's a really, really unusual word. And Mark had to be thinking about Isaiah 35 when he used that word, because if he was just mute, he would have said mute, but he gets this word that we don't find hardly any place. And he describes this man this way. And so there's something powerful going on about Jesus' arrival connecting back to the way that Isaiah described the Messiah's arrival. This is just profoundly important that we connect these things. I just have to say that this is really tragic. Think about it. When he tried to speak, he could not be understood. But there came a time in his life when he stopped being able to hear what people were saying to him. You want to talk about being cut out from all things in the world. That I'm just going to be honest about this. This is a moment in my life when I had been living in England. I was 21, and I was the only American living where I lived. And I was I would use the word, it was wonderful and terrible at the same time. It was very stressful. And I developed a speech problem that when Jennifer, who was my girlfriend at the time, came to visit me, actually noticed that I was having a speech problem. And a lot of it had to do with the fear of being recognized as somebody who's different, and just a lot of stuff was going on. And I remember living through that space in my life, and being really, really nervous about even speaking at all. In fact, I went to a dinner with a group of students from the college that I went to, that I was working with the students. I was not a student. I was working with the students, and I'd been working with them for about 6 months. And I asked for the salt, and they heard me speak, and 2 or 3 of them looked at me and said, "You're not English." Because I'd been so fearful of speaking, I just did my job and stayed out of the way. And now, this was just a short period in my life that I worked through. I can't imagine what it would be like to have a speech impediment where you could not be understood at all. And your only connection to what was happening around you, at least you could hear people talking, and then that to go away. I can't think of anything more tragic, and there's something deeply existentially heartbreaking about this, I'm sure, to God. And we see this in Jesus in this whole passage. By the way, deaf people were not considered to be unclean. And I say that like it's supposed to be a positive, but they were classified, and the Jews back then had a great way of classifying people as this or that. Now, they were put in a classification of people who were not educated enough to keep the law. Well, there were 4 other people besides deaf people in the classification. Now, don't write to me about this, okay? Women weren't educated enough to keep the law in the mind of the Jewish. I have a note in here. This is a very biased position held by Jewish religious elite, okay? Women, that's like half the world. They can't be educated enough. It's against the law. Did you know it's against the law to teach a woman to read? Anyway, it wasn't their own fault. It was a crime in Israel to teach a woman to read. Anyway, they didn't know the law. Like, I love this. Slaves, they weren't educated enough to. That's stupid, because 1/3 of the population were slaves, and like all the middle class, like teachers and artisans and all that, they were all slaves, and they probably most of them could read something. Then imbeciles, I love imbeciles, whatever that's supposed to be, and then minors. So there's your category. You got 5 things that they're not unclean, but they're not educated enough to keep the law. So this poor guy, he's thrown in with imbeciles. And women's not so bad, but imbeciles? Come on. There's a bit of debate about why these people brought this man to Jesus. Most translations lean towards that they desire for Jesus to heal him, because here's why, though it's exactly what the NLT says. But they're leaning into something which isn't in the text. In the text, it just says that they beseeched him, or they begged him to put his hands on them. Now, most people just assume that they meant for Jesus to heal him. We have to remember that the only thing that Jesus had done with these people was cast out a demon and drive those demons into pigs who ran down a hill and killed themselves. Now, there's nothing in this story that implies exorcism. I suppose his reputation could have preceded him at some level, but there are some that say, no, they didn't want Jesus to heal this man. They just wanted him to put his hands of blessing on him. Now, there's so much connection between healing and touching. Some scholars say, no, this man's situation was so pathetic that they just wanted some kind of blessing in the moment. The only experience, as I said, they'd had with Jesus was casting out demons. But my thinking is that they weren't thinking about it. They didn't know why this was happening to this man. They may have thought it was a demon, but I doubt that. I don't know what in the Jewish world, if he'd been a Jewish man, they would have known somebody sinned or this wouldn't have happened to him. But the Gentiles didn't operate that way. They did feel that the gods brought on bad luck, or that demons could inhabit people and cause things to happen. I think that what these people were expecting was a miraculous change. And that's why they brought him to Jesus. What Jesus does next, though, is unexpected but it can all be understood. And it's all part of Jesus' compassion in the moment. In verse 33, it says, Jesus led him away from the crowd so they could be alone. Now, I don't have a whole lot of time. We're going to have to cover more of this next week. In the Greek, that verse really reads like this: Jesus takes him away from the crowd privately, is a good way to talk about it. And there are a number of thoughts on why Jesus would have done this. He doesn't do this anywhere else. He doesn't take anybody away by themselves to heal them anyplace else. Now, some say that this is a great moment of great compassion, that this man has certainly been marginalized and probably hasn't had anyone give him direct attention like this in a long time. And the thought is that Jesus was making certain that this man knew that he had Jesus' complete attention, that Jesus didn't want anyone to come between this man and himself, and so he takes him away privately. Other people say that Jesus was about to heal the man in ways that mirrored some of the pagan healer practices, and that he didn't want people imitating his actions in the future, thinking they could heal people who were deaf and couldn't speak by doing what Jesus did. And others say that Jesus didn't want anyone to know what happened as a part of his desire to keep his healing power a secret. And I'm unsure about all of these except the one that Jesus was paying close attention to him. I'm going to wrap it up with these things right here this time, and we'll get right into it next week. But I am unsure that any of the other explanations make sense. My heart leans towards the fact that Jesus was making this man the center of his attention. I cannot believe that Jesus had some sort of ulterior motive in mind, in a positive sense, like to keep others from imitating him, so he takes this guy off to the side. I can't imagine Jesus was thinking, I've got to take this guy off to the side because I'm about to do some things that people think they can do. No, I can't imagine. And that other thing about him taking him off to the side so that people, so that people wouldn't see what he was doing. Well, whatever he was going to do, this man was going to he's going to be healed to speak. He could tell him what he did. I don't think that had anything to do with it. I think Jesus was so moved by this man's tragic situation. And there's a lot of tragic in this. Maybe I'll just say it this as we finish up. There is something powerfully important about the fact that this man could not hear or speak, which meant he couldn't understand anyone else when they spoke, and he couldn't be understood when he spoke. And part of the existential nature of the creation of mankind with Adam is that when Adam was created, he could understand language and speak. He was not born as an infant and had to learn language. He was created to understand and to be understood. And Eve was created understanding and being understood. And there's this huge thing in the creation of the world that is absolutely important, that God made us to be able to communicate and to understand others as they communicate. There's just all this stuff with the Tower of Babel and everything that's all mixed up in this. And my feeling is this, that when Jesus saw this man who, because of the entrance of sin into the world and the breakdown of things physical, this man now could not understand and could not be understood. And that's like a flip of everything that God intended. And as we get it deeper into this, I think you'll see that this is why Jesus reacts and responds the way that he does. Everything he does from here on out can be explained as a part of him wanting to heal this terrible circumstance that he wanted to happen to nobody. That's where we are. We'll start right there with Jesus taking him off to the side and doing this in private next week. But man, I guess I'm worked up, but this one really works me up. It just really works me up. So thanks. I'll see you next week. And great. I'll see you next week.